All right, this week we are going to be working on Frances Brooks' novel, The Excursion. This is one of my favorite novels in 18th century studies, so I'm excited to share it with you. I've got a little bit of background information about Frances Brooks on Panther so I'll just say that she had written many other novels, most of them epistolary, most of them, all of them, much longer than this, and of course also The Old Maid, the periodical. So she's a pretty well-established author by the time she wrote The Excursion. If you look at the notes on Panther, I have a rundown of all of the characters because there are a lot of characters in this novel, and it can be confusing to keep track of who is related to who and what are the relationships, and there's Mrs. and Lady and Lord and all that. So keep that with you if you get confused as you read, but I wanted to go over just a few major themes that I want you to pay attention to as you read that I hope will tie into some of the things that we've already been talking about during the previous weeks of this course. So first, narrative style. As I mentioned, Brooks' previous novels were epistolary, and so obviously they weren't written in a third-person narrative style. This is third-person omniscient, and you'll notice when you read it that the tone that the narrator takes is very opinionated, very entertaining. There's lots of commentary provided by the narrator, but it's also, you don't get these long, for the most part, narrative passages that we have seen in other instances of 18th century literature. So the style is shorter, tighter, fast-paced, a little bit more dramatic. I mean, we get some scenes that are entirely dialogue, so it's more like, seeing them acted out. We move quickly from one scene to another without a whole lot of exposition. Some of the chapters are very short and tight, and it's a different style than we have seen. And in fact, it's a different style than much of previous 18th century novels. So when we talk about the history of 18th century novels, the classic way of separating styles, and this is of course outdated and overgeneralized, but the classic way that people still appeal to is, are you Richardsonian, meaning are you like Samuel Richardson with these very, very long novels, many of them epistolary. Pamela, Clarissa are his most famous ones, Sir Charles Grandison. Extremely long, but also extremely dramatic, with lots of emotion and, servant girls being trapped in rooms and rakes and cocottes and the whole thing. Or are you Fielding-esque, after Henry Fielding, which is a little bit more comic, generally shorter, kind of a biting narrator, strong narrative voice. And to look ahead a little bit past, we're at 1777 now, if we look into the 18 teens and we get to Jane Austen, then you'll see some of the debate in her novels as well about whether she harkens back to this tradition of Richardson or this tradition of Fielding. And you can kind of see that too. And those of you who have read her novels know that she has sometimes a comic narrative voice, sometimes it's a little bit more moralistic, depending on what's going on with the characters in the novels. So here we are with Frances Brooks. Her earlier novels are considered more Richardsonian. This one is considered a little bit more Fielding-esque, but again, making any kind of generalization like that is not necessarily going to get to everything that we need to get to. So, we can just say that she's an established writer on her own. She writes like Frances Brooks. I don't think we really need to say she writes like one of these previous men. But these are the traditions that come up. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring that up is because in the preface to the second edition of the novel, we're reading the first edition, but the edition that we're using includes the preface to the second. This is important later, and I'll explain why. But in that, she talks about the role of female novelists in this tradition of male novelists. Where is the role of female novelists? What is she arguing that women can do as authors, as professional writers, not just as writers, but as professional writers, that differs from what men are doing in their novels? And we see references throughout the Excursion to these different characteristics that are typical of 18th century fiction by other well-known, mostly male authors. For example, on page 11, the narrator notes that Colonel Dormer had warned Maria against worthless acquaintance, unmerited calumny, and ruinous expense, which of course is caution that Maria should have probably taken. But the narrator notes that he did not caution her against the giants of the modern novel who carry off young ladies by force in post chaises and six with the blinds up, and confine freeborn English women in their country houses, etc. So there, of course, he is referring to the novels of Samuel Richardson, or she, the narrator is referring to that she. Anyway, so there are sprinklings throughout the Excursion of references to 18th century literature. A couple other things that make this distinct in compared to what we have read so far. We have a very specific timeline, which is unusual for a novel of this time period. At the beginning of book 3, the narrator notes what year it is, and then if you take that, you can go back and you can actually date, because the narrator gives specific dates for when things are happening throughout the book. So I have notes all over my book about when certain things are happening. We also get a very specific accounting of the amount of money that Maria has. And this is important because one of the major themes that I'll talk about in a second is the role of the professional writer and women as professional writers. So the fact that we have a very exacting keeping track of the amount of money that she has shows us how her money is dwindling and where she's placing her hopes in the writing to kind of get her out of that hole that she finds herself in. So it indicates that the main character here does have a very real dependence on the literary marketplace, on having success as a professional author. Now, before I go further, I should note her name is Maria Villiers. In England in the 18th century, that would have been pronounced Mariah. So if you ever talk about this book in a professional setting, people probably will call her Mariah, but I have it in my head as Maria, and I know I'm going to trip up if I keep going back and forth. So just wanted to put that out there. It's probably supposed to be Mariah. So another major theme that we have here, we've got engagement with contemporary discussions about the novel. We have some themes of professional writing, which I'll build on in a second, but realistic fiction in that regard. Third thing that we have is dangers of the world. So the narrator here, Brooke, through the narrator, seems to be cautioning young women in particular against the dangers of being out in the world without being adequately prepared for it. Maria is intelligent, she's witty, but she's very innocent and naive, and she doesn't have the tools to be able to see that Lady Hardy is taking advantage of her and is not somebody who has her best interest at heart and is using her, essentially. She also does not have the tools to recognize what's happening with Lord Melville. I mean, everybody else can kind of see what's going on, and she can't. She really genuinely thinks that she's going to become Lady Melville, and she's stunned when she realizes that that's not the case. And that's partially because she doesn't have anybody guiding her. So an additional theme here is the lack of having a guardian and how dangerous that is. Her parents are dead. Her guardian, her uncle, Colonel Dormer, who clearly loves her, can't be bothered to leave his garden to take her to England and chaperone her through all of this. It turns out Mrs. Herbert would have been an excellent guide if she had been in town, but she ends up trusting Lady Hardy because Mrs. Merrick told her that she could. Mrs. Merrick is clearly not a good judge of character. Lady Hardy is clearly not a good judge of character. And we even see Lady Hardy described as being a former milkmaid who had been a mistress of the nobleman who eventually married her. So everybody else kind of knows this. Everybody else sees this. Maria can't see it, that because Lady Hardy has all the trappings of a respectable person, she can't see that she's not a respectable person. All of this leads to Maria misinterpreting social events. So she ends up acting the role of the coquette without actually trying to be the coquette. If we think about Charlotte Lennox's poem, The Coquette, that we read back with Rape of the Lock, that indicates that somebody is trying to be a coquette. Here, Maria is making a lot of those same, or doing a lot of those same behaviors, but she doesn't know what she's doing. She really thinks that Lord Melville is in love with her and can't see the game that they're playing. Speaking of Lord Melville, he is clearly supposed to be the model of the rake here, right? That he's he gambles, he drinks, he has a mistress, he's sort of playing with Maria's heart. He has a respectable life on the side that he's not really willing to live as his real life. But I think it's really interesting that Brooke doesn't really blame him for all of this. Like, she goes out of her way to indicate that he really has a pure heart and that if he had had better guidance from his father, he would have had a different life. So she, again, is critical of the lack of guardianship and guidance for the characters. That Lord Claremont is the one who is pushing his son to be a rake, and Lord Melville doesn't really know how to be otherwise. So let's move on to our next theme, professional writing. So this is established very, very early in the novel, that in the very first scene, on the first page, Maria sees a coach go by, and that the narrator knows that this raises her ambition. And throughout, especially the early part of the novel, but really throughout the whole thing, we see Maria reflecting on her hope for fame as a writer. She wants to see her plays sold. She's imagining the audiences who are adoring her. She's imagining sold out performances, all of these things. She doesn't only want the money of being a writer, but she also wants the professional accolades from being a writer. In fact, when she thinks she's going to be Lady Melville, so she doesn't really even need the money in this fantasy that she's built for herself, she still wants the accolades. So that identity of being a successful professional writer is important to her. Second, she makes a note, or the narrator makes a note, that she actually brings her manuscripts with her to London in case she should need them. So she has this intent. She writes with the intent of selling her manuscripts. She's not writing for fun. She's not writing because it's a little pastime. She's writing because she wants to be a professional writer. The narrator notes that she knows she has genius. She knows that she's something special, so she kind of has to figure out how to get it out there. We have that amazing scene where Mr. Hammond comes back and reports to her how disastrous the meeting went with the theater manager, and the way that she is devastated with that story, the way that she knows really that she can't even be the one to approach the theater manager, which is why Mr. Hammond is here at all, indicates some of the trials that she knows a professional woman is going to face. Towards the middle-ish end of the book, when she realizes what Lord Melville's true intentions were, there's one scene where she writes a letter. Well, before we get to the letter, she realizes what Lord Melville's true intentions were, and she calls him, and the whole situation really, an idol of my own creation. So she's indicating even there, she recognizes that she made this up, that it was her creative imagination that made her think that everything with Lord Melville was different than it was. So she's recognizing the way that her creative genius is interplaying with her real life. Then the letter she plans to send to him by way of explanation of all of this. She ends up not sending it, of course, because Mrs. Herbert finally shows up and returns to London. But she notes that she plans to save it for a future novel. So all of Maria's actions and thoughts and everything, even when she's ashamed, even when it's the deepest tragedy, she's thinking to the future of how she's going to use that in her writing, which indicates that, again, this is not just a thing that she likes to do, in the evenings in the parlor or whatever to entertain herself. This is how she identifies herself, and this is kind of a new thing in the 18th century novel. We don't have a lot of female characters, really I can't think of any other ones besides Maria, who are very intentionally trying to be a professional writer. Certainly, there are lots of real-life professional writers. We've read many of them during this course, but it hadn't really made its way into literature until now, so that's kind of a new thing. And then finally, of course, when Lady Blast was out to ruin Maria's reputation by writing that gossipy letter that ended up not getting published in the gossip magazine and all of that, it's another form of writing. It's a way that another character is taking Maria's life and fictionalizing it. So she's adopting Maria's life, which Maria wants to be the writer, but then putting it into her own writing and telling her own story. So as you read, all of this is to say that as you read, I want you to pay attention to the places where writing is written about in a self-reflexive manner. So where Maria thinks about herself as a writer, where the narrator talks about events in terms of people writing their own lives, writing their own stories, the way in which the writing of the stories becomes corrupted by other characters, the way in which imagination is shown to be a creative force through the events of the novel. So one of the most famous professional writing scenes in the novel is in fact the scene where, well, that we only hear about through Mr. Hammond, but where Mr. Hammond goes to visit the theater manager. And the theater manager here was actually a real life theater manager. He doesn't get mentioned by name in the book, but everybody knew that it was David Garrick, who is a professional writer, actor, also playwright, but professional actor, theater manager at Drury Lane Theater, in the 18th century, immensely popular, like sold out shows, top of his field. Everybody loved him. Everybody wanted him to produce one of their plays. And in the early 1750s, before Brooks settled into becoming a novelist, she had written a tragedy called Virginia, and she wanted to get Garrick's theater, Drury Lane, to produce it. She submitted the play, and she learned that Garrick had not ever read it because he received too many other plays that were similar in theme. Then, with that failure, she moved on to writing The Old Maid, the periodical. And in one issue of The Old Maid, she critiqued Garrick's performance in a play, and he took great offense at it. And again, everybody knew who she was talking about. Everybody kind of knew the whole story. So then when early reviews of this first edition of The Excursion, the one that we're reading that was published in 1777, early reviewers viewed this scene where Mr. Hammond is stammering and Mr. Garrick comes across, the theater manager, comes across as being kind of a buffoon, being a comic character, certainly being not very nice to Maria. Early critics viewed this portrayal as being extremely mean-spirited, and Brooke was criticized for that. So then in the second edition that came out in 1784, that whole scene was rewritten. And if you look in the footnotes of the book that we're using, it has the text from the second edition, so you can see how it was changed. The most notable change is that instead of acting out the meeting that Mr. Hammond had with Garrick, he just summarizes it. So it takes out all of the stammering and all of the comic, kind of mocking nature of that scene. Couple more things. One thing, I've always, I have mentioned frequently that we need to be careful about making generalizations about what life was like for 18th century women. We can't, be specific about that or make assumptions without having any kind of evidence. I think this novel is a piece of evidence to show how restrictive, at least the social circles in which Maria was intending to run, at least how restrictive that was, and how restrictive it was to be a woman who wanted to be a professional writer. Again, we need to think in terms of time period, in terms of social class. There are lots of restrictions in place. So I'm not making broad claims. I'm just saying for somebody who was like Maria, or perhaps we could extend it and say like Frances Brooke, this novel illustrates a lot of what those social restrictions would have been. For example, think of how Maria had to kind of pace the floors in her apartment waiting for an invitation to leave. She couldn't go out really anywhere. She couldn't go to society unless she had somebody there kind of sponsoring her. She thinks that she needs to have all of the trappings of wealth, even if she doesn't have wealth. So she's very much aware of what her public persona is like. She gets criticized when she's at a party for flirting with somebody because it suggests that she is of poor character. She knows that she can't go to the theater manager herself, and so appeals to Mr. Hammond to help her. So there's a lot of restrictions that make it really hard for her to do anything without having some kind of sponsorship from an older woman or from a man who can help her through that process. So it does indicate that, I think we all know this, but I'm just saying that some of these scenes and some of these details that were in the novel are good evidence for the social restrictions that were placed on women. So the last thing that I want to talk about then is the end of the novel, because there's quite a bit of critical controversy, and I have an opinion about how I read the end of the novel, and I don't know that it's one that's shared by too many people, but I'll tell you what the kind of the controversy is and what I think. So I don't know if you've finished the novel yet by the time you're watching this, but you will see at the end of the novel a whole bunch of things happen. There's just this crazy confluence of events where everything gets resolved and everything's happy and everything's fine. One of them, of course, is that Maria falls in love with Colonel Dormer. Colonel Dormer has a major inheritance that allows him to retire to a giant country house. Mr. Hammond declares, "This is great. We will perform plays. We will write plays. We will have our own little theatrical society in this country house. And, we can continue to do all of the things that Maria wasn't able to do in the literary marketplace of London." So, unsurprisingly, I think, a lot of the critical consensus here is that this is a bad thing for Maria, that the novel ends kind of letting her give up on her dream of being a professional writer, and that this is not overall a positive argument about the potential for women to be critical successes in the literary marketplace. However, I think there are a couple things that we need to think about there. One is this division between public and private spaces that I talked about a little bit when we were talking about literary or periodicals. and Jürgen Habermas and the idea of the public sphere and the private sphere. And there are several critics, when you talk about where this division falls, that point out that there's really a range of sociability that happens when you're dealing with the public and the private sphere. So, for example, you might have a small group of people who would meet at a country house who would be meeting in a private setting because they're in a house, but they all have somewhat public lives. So if they're bringing their public experiences into a private setting, then it's not like this is such an isolated group that you're not getting any influence from the outside world. You're not having any kind of interaction with the outside world. So these lines of public and private really get blurred. And even Habermas, when he's talking about the public sphere of the coffee house, indicates that everybody who's coming into this public sphere is coming from a private setting. So we can't just say we are private citizens who come together in public. Sometimes we are public citizens who come together in private. So there is some interaction. There's some way that ideas get transmitted between these absolute dichotomized ways of talking about public and private. So my sense of the ending of the novel then is that this isn't so bad, because Maria obviously was dealing with scandal and stress and all of that. It removes that aspect from this. And then she's able to present these plays in a way that might not be public in the sense that it's a Drury Lane theater, but it's not like it's shut off from society either. She's still able to see her writing come to life. Surely there are visitors that would come into this house. She still gets to work out her ideas. She still gets to be the creative voice behind all of these dramas. So I don't think it's as negative an ending as a lot of critics think it is. However, as I mentioned, I think I'm the minority in that position, so I would like to hear what you all think after you finish reading the novel. So that can be something that can come up during the discussion boards. So I've already talked too long. I hope you enjoy the novel. I really, really do. And it's kind of short, which is nice. And the chapters are short, which is encouraging. So yeah, have a good day.